My fellow Sazaiters, this is part 2 of the Rex Nhongo series as we take a look at the life story of General Solomon Mujuru. Understanding the story of this man will help us appreciate the dynamics of the ZANU-PF Game of Thrones, especially in this period where ZANU-PF is venturing into uncharted territory. Not only because of Mnangagwa's term limit extension, which by the way is very dangerous, but also because of this concept of a peaceful transition from one leader to the other, which is a concept that is very foreign, not only in ZANU-PF, but also in Zimbabwe in general. I mean, you do realize that in all the leading Zimbabwean political parties before and after independence, there has never been a peaceful, drama-free transition from one leader to the other. There has never been. Whether you're talking of ZANU-PF, ZAPU, the MDC, CCC, all of them without exception, there has never been a peaceful transfer of power from one leader to the other. And that on its own says a lot about our politics. But the man we are talking about today, Rex Nhongo, was instrumental in the transfer of power, well, the drama-filled transfer of power from Dabaningi Stole to Robert Mugabe. And in his latter days, he was also instrumental in blocking the transfer of power from Robert Mugabe to the current president, Emmerson Mnangagwa. In fact, ED only became vice president of ZANU after the death of General Solomon Mujuru. My fellow Sazaiters, slay queens and bingers, socialites, papalites, wasinamalites, varikudyarais, newasinamarites. Welcome to the special report. Okay, so in part 1, we talked about the birth of Mujuru in 1945, his early activism in politics in the 60s, his military training under ZAPU from 1967 to 1969, his defection from ZAPU to ZANU in 1971, and how he met his wife, Teura Iropa, Joyce, in 1974. But today, we want to take a look at his rise in ZANLA to becoming second in command and how he ended up commanding both ZIPRA and ZANLA, and later still influencing the rise of Robert Mugabe to the position of ZANU president. As I mentioned in part 1, by the time Solomon Mujuru meets his future wife, Joyce, at Tongogara's house in Zambia, he's already a member of the High Command. What was the High Command? Well, you see, ZANU had 2 organs which were responsible for running its war effort. These were the Darere Chimurenga and the High Command. The Darere Chimurenga, also known as the War Council, was responsible for providing political oversight and formulating war strategies. It was headed by Chitepo. The High Command was responsible for implementing the strategies of the Darere Chimurenga. The leader of the High Command was responsible for all military operations, making him effectively the boss of the army, with the political title of Secretary for Defense, answering and reporting to the Darere Chimurenga. Noah Mukono was the first leader of the High Command and was replaced by Tongogara in 1973. So, it took Solomon Mujuru only 2 years to break into the ZANLA High Command. Remember, he joined ZANU in 1971, defecting from ZAPU, and by 1973, he was already one of ZANLA's top commanders. This set him up for a very big role in the years that followed, because the army of ZANU soon became more influential than its political leadership, and Mujuru was at the center of it all, often being the decisive factor. In fact, the events that happened in 1974 and 1975 are what brought Nhongo to the center of the ZANU Game of Thrones. You see, by 1974, the senior political leadership of ZANU had been in detention for 10 years. They were arrested in 1964, a year after the formation of ZANU. The arrested leaders included people like Party President Ndabaningi Stole, the Vice President Leopold Takawira, the Secretary General Robert Mugabe, the Treasurer General Enos Nkala, and other senior Central Committee members like Maurice Nyagumbo, Morton Malianga, Edgar Tekere, and others. These are the people who instructed Chitepo to lead ZANU in exile and prepare for the armed struggle. The first properly organized guerrilla incursions into Rhodesia by ZANU started in 1966, 2 years after most of these men had been arrested. Of course, some were arrested in 1963 and some in 1965. And of course, the number kept increasing. They were finally released in 1974 to participate in the talks that were meant to bring about a negotiated settlement. Their release was part of a ceasefire deal agreed to and signed by Ian Smith. This was the so-called détente period from 1974 to 1975. The Rhodesian War was stopped to give negotiations a chance. But ZANU was never really interested or invested in these talks, preferring instead to win independence via the gun. So Kaunda and Nyerere literally forced ZANU to participate in these talks. What made the situation awkward for ZANU was the fact that the party now had two factions. One faction loyal to Mugabe and another loyal to the party president Sithole. You see, what happened is that before these men were released from prison, they had staged a coup against their party president, Ndabaningi Stole. 5 Central Committee members, Mugabe, Tekere, Nyagumbo, Nkala, and Malianga, convened a meeting in prison and voted to replace Ndabaningi Stole with Robert Mugabe. And since Mugabe was the beneficiary of this coup, it basically means that the decision in prison to remove Stole was made by 3 people, Nkala, Tekere, and Nyagumbo. However, when they got released, the SADC leaders, who at the time were known as the frontline leaders leading frontline states, refused to acknowledge Mugabe as the ZANU president. They only recognized Sithole. Chitepo and Tongogara also refused to recognize Mugabe and remained loyal to Sithole. So that's how ZANU ended up with 2 factions. But the ZANU factionalism at this point was very complex. Because you see, the party president, Ndabaningi Stole, was very serious about these talks with Ian Smith. But the chairman, Herbert Chitepo, was vociferously critical of the talks, preferring instead war. Yet, he remained loyal to the leadership of Ndabaningi Stole and resisted the takeover of the party by Robert Mugabe. So, Chitepo resisted Robert Mugabe, a man who just like him was against the talks. A man who just like him preferred war. By the way, the SADC leaders actually viewed Chitepo as an impediment to the success of the negotiations during the détente period. As fate would have it, Herbert Chitepo was assassinated in March 1975 in Zambia. Leaders of the Dare and the High Command were rounded up and arrested by the Zambian authorities on allegations of having assassinated Chairman Herbert Chitepo. Tongogara was able to escape to Mozambique but was later handed over to the Zambian authorities by Frelimo. Rex Nhongo and Robson Manyika managed to escape to Tanzania, where they found refuge. They traveled separately in order to reduce chances of both of them getting caught. But the fact that the authorities in Tanzania protected Nhongo and Manyika at a time when the Zambians were after them tells you how divided the SADC leaders were on the death of Chitepo. Some were not happy with how Kaunda had handled the issue. In fact, Nhongo and Manyika were very lucky to have escaped to Tanzania because their fellow comrades were severely tortured and forced to sign affidavits confessing to Chitepo's assassination, which confessions were inadmissible in court. Even General Tongo was not spared from this torture. Now, coming to the issue of how Rex Nhongo escaped from Zambia, which as you can imagine wasn't easy given the heavy police and military presence in Zambia at the time, because Kaunda wasn't playing. He was baying for their blood. You see, for Kaunda, it wasn't just about getting to the bottom of who had assassinated Chitepo. He had some vested interests in the issue. You see, Kaunda generally disliked ZANU. He always saw it as an unnecessary rebel group. Kaunda always had a soft spot for ZAPU because of his long-standing friendship and brotherhood with Joshua Nkomo. But what especially annoyed Kaunda was the reluctance by some ZANU leaders to unite with other nationalist leaders under the ANC and negotiate with Ian Smith. That thing really annoyed Kenneth Kaunda. So Kaunda wanga wakutopinda nepesnari and some Dare and high command leaders were in for it. They were severely tortured. So indeed, Robson Manyika and Nhongo were really lucky to have escaped Zambia. Now, coming to how Rex Nhongo actually escaped Zambia, Joyce MUJURU explains it this way. She says, Rex Nhongo escaped Zambia with 3 women. So he was walking with them, flirting, hugging, kissing. And when the Zambian police saw them, they were annoyed. They said, who are these lovers who are disturbing us from this great work that we are doing in trying to capture the ZANU thugs we have murdered their chairman? Hey, who are these stupid lovers? Let them go through. Hindai. This is how, believe it or not, Rex Nhongo was able to escape from Zambia. They let him through, thinking that they were getting rid of some nuisance, some crazy people who were publicly displaying their affection. Unbeknown to them, they were letting go one of the men that they were actually after. That is how Rex Nhongo escaped to Tanzania, where he, together with Robson Manyika, were given sanctuary and material support by President Julius Nyerere. Nhongo quickly asserted himself at the Mgagao Zanla camp, where he, through the help of the Tanzanian authorities, spearheaded farming projects to secure food for the Zanla fighters. So rather than wait for handouts from the OAU Liberation Committee and international donors, the Mgagao camp was now on the road to self-sufficiency in food. This made Rex Nhongo very popular. He contributed in providing the much-needed stability among Zanla fighters in Tanzania at a time when the military leadership was in detention. Meanwhile, the ZANU president, Ndabaningistole, did little to secure the release of his commanders and members of the Dare. He made a little effort in sourcing food for thousands of guerrillas in the Zanla training camps. At one point, he chose to visit his sick daughter overseas, then attend to the welfare of his army, and furthermore, he made erratic remarks about the liberation struggle, which put him at loggerheads with his comrades. Since his release, he had lost the radicalism that saw him lead a breakaway faction of ZAPU that became known as ZANU. Sithole had become soft as wool, preferring negotiations over war, which strangely is the same strategy he lambasted Nkomo for when he and his comrades left ZAPU to form ZANU. Consequently, the Dare leaders who were in detention, namely Tongogara, Rugare Gumbo, Mudzi, and Kangai, issued a decree that Zanla guerrillas had to do away with Sithole's leadership and work on resuming the war. The Dare leadership also instructed Zanla guerrillas to replace Sithole with Mugabe. This is what gave birth to the Mgagao Declaration, which was signed in November 1975, getting rid of Sithole and installing Mugabe as president of ZANU. And guess what? General Nyikadzino Constantino Gouveia Dominic was also part of the commanders who signed the Mgagao Declaration. At this time, he was known as Dominic Chinenge. MUJURU was also there, but he didn't sign the Mgagao Declaration because he was on the run, remember? The Zambians were after him. He didn't want to be a murder suspect on one side and also have his name on yet another episode in ZANU, removing a high-ranking leader, this time around, the president. But it's interesting that Robert Mugabe was always getting catapulted to the presidency by men in prison. First, it was those Central Committee members in 1973-74 who tried to make him president but failed. And now, as we have just seen, the Dare members in prison engineered the Mgagao Declaration, which declaration got rid of Ndabaningistole and installed Robert Mugabe as president. But as you will soon see, some of the commanders who signed the Mgagao Declaration later deserted Robert Mugabe. Chigame che politics ichi itaimega. After the Mgagao Declaration, Robert Mugabe's takeover was not easy at all because the SADC leaders did not recognize Mugabe. They only recognized Ndabaningistole. Keep in mind when I say SADC leaders, I'm just trying to make it relatable to everyone because at the time, they were not known as SADC leaders. They were known as frontline leaders leading frontline states. Samora Machel in particular did not trust Robert Mugabe. This is because at the time, Mugabe did not have an international profile, so he was relatively unknown, especially to world leaders. The most prominent political leaders in ZANU were Herbert Chitepo and Ndabaningistole. The Mgagao Declaration was not only about removing Stole and replacing him with Mugabe, it was also about the resumption of war. Remember, war had been stopped in 1974 to give negotiations a chance. But the negotiations went nowhere because the political leaders failed to agree on the modalities of majority rule. This meant war had to continue. The OAU, together with Nyerere and Samora, realized that if war had to resume, ZIPRA and ZANLA had to unite in order to broaden the war effort. This is what led to the formation of ZIPA, the Zimbabwe People's Army, which was a military union of ZIPRA and ZANLA, with Solomon Mujuru as its commander and Alfred Nikita Mangena as its political commissar. ZIPA had a military committee whose positions were occupied by members of ZIPRA and ZANLA. Interestingly, the highest ranking ZIPRA commander, Alfred Nikita Mangena, was put under the command of Mujuru, who ordinarily was junior to him in terms of rank. Nikita Mangena was the equivalent of Tongogara, but he graciously agreed to salute Mujuru. Be that as it may, the choice of Mujuru to lead ZIPA kinda made sense, especially when you consider that he was probably the best compromise candidate, having served in both ZIPRA and ZANLA. Plus, he was highly regarded by Frelimo, having trained and fought with them in the early 70s. So, the fact that ZIPA was going to operate from Mozambique made Nhongo a natural choice for commander. However, the ZIPA project wasn't successful because of the deep-rooted vendettas between ZAPU and ZANU. Remember, the ZAPU split of 1963 was very nasty. Very, very nasty. Plus, ideologically, ZAPU and ZANU were different. ZIPRA was Soviet-backed and ZANLA was China-backed. Remember, the Zimbabwean armed struggle was being fought during the China-Soviet split. This was the period when the world's two biggest communist nations, the Soviet Union and China, were having a diplomatic rift. So, the hostilities between China and Russia were also transferred to ZIPRA and ZANLA. Or I should say, the hostilities between China and the Soviet Union were transferred to ZIPRA and ZANLA, which is what created the ideological difference between ZIPRA and ZANLA. Remember, the Soviets believed that the spark of revolution had to be ignited by the working class. Marxism, as practiced by the Soviets, emphasized on the dictatorship of the working class. Furthermore, they believed that the most decisive factor in war are weapons, and that to liberate a country, you needed a conventional army. However, things were very different in China. The Chinese revolution was based on peasants, not the working class. That's why you see ZANU-PF has always had a stronghold in rural areas, because that's where peasants live. And this stronghold is achieved by any means necessary. because Mao's teachings say that the end justifies the means. If something is noble enough, then it doesn't matter how you attain it. You could even kill millions in pursuit of an idea that you think is noble. Anyway, I digressed. The point was, ZIPA failed because of the deep-rooted, long-standing vendettas and ideological differences, which basically meant that there was no unity. The ZIPA commanders made the mistake of sending the soldiers to the battlefield way too early before addressing the elephant in the room, which was the lack of unity. The guerrillas had to first mature in unity before they could be sent to fight. So, rather than fighting the enemy, they started killing each other, fighting about anything and everything, including food. Can you imagine? In the end, ZIPRA pulled out of ZIPA, but Zanla remained. Being commander of ZIPA effectively made Rex Nhongo the most important Zanla commander outside prison. He would soon play a very pivotal role in the ascension of Robert Mugabe to the throne. You see, Mugabe left Rhodesia with Tekere in 1975 to lead the armed struggle. However, as I mentioned before, Samora Machel only recognized Ndabaningistole. He rubbished the Mgagao Declaration. So when Robert Mugabe crossed the border to Mozambique, Samora Machel restricted him at a place called Quelimane for over a year from 1975 to 1976. Machel did this to stop Mugabe from gaining influence among the Zanla guerrillas. But despite Machel's hostility towards Mugabe, the ZIPA military commanders occasionally held secret meetings with Mugabe and ended up sneaking him into Zanla camps. However, after some time, the ZIPA military committee grew increasingly frustrated with Mugabe's demeanor. They felt he was too dictatorial, pompous, and sneaky. They also hated the fact that he would address Rex Nhongo by his totem, a practice which was forbidden. They started distancing themselves from Robert Mugabe. They even started regretting supporting him to take over from Sithole. But unbeknown to them, Mugabe and Nhongo continued having secret meetings, with Nhongo engaging with Samora Machel on the possibility of Mugabe taking over from Sithole. But Samora would have none of it. At one time, he actually spat at Nhongo, shouting at him and questioning why he was so desperate to hand over political power to Mugabe when he himself, Nhongo, could actually have that political power unto himself and become ZANU leader if he wanted to. But Nhongo maintained that Mugabe was the rightful person to take over because he was the most senior political leader available, with the vice president Leopold Takawira having died in 1972. Finally, in late 1976, Machel consented to Mugabe's takeover just before the Geneva Conference, which was held in Switzerland to discuss the possibility of a negotiated settlement, albeit with a moderate government, the so-called Kissinger Plan. Tongogara, together with other Dare members, were released from prison ahead of this conference. However, ZIPA refused to attend the Geneva Conference. In fact, one of the top commanders in ZIPA, Zinashe Machingura, with the support of the ZIPA military committee, actually announced on Radio Mozambique that ZIPA was not aligned to any political party. This deeply annoyed Robert Mugabe because it meant that he lacked control of any army, unlike Joshua Nkomo, who controlled ZIPRA. Remember, ZIPRA had pulled out of ZIPA, leaving Zanla commanders in control, with Nhongo still their commander. Robert Mugabe called for Zinashe Machingura to retract the stance he took on Radio Mozambique, but Machingura did not chicken out. He maintained that ZIPA was non-aligned. So, Mugabe went to the Geneva Conference with Tongo, but the ZIPA military committee refused to go. The presence of Tongo without ZIPA meant nothing. Remember, he had spent 18 months in prison. ZIPA was formed in his absence. When he got released, many of his junior commanders were now against him. The military power was now with ZIPA. And that is why it was so crucial for ZIPA to attend the Geneva conference. But they refused. They didn't want negotiations. They wanted war, and most importantly, they wanted nothing to do with Mugabe. They had already made up their mind about him. This left Mugabe in a very precarious situation. Remember, the Geneva conference was his first major event as ZANU president. You are not a ZANU president if you don't command the confidence of the army. Ndawanenge Sole fell by the wayside because he lost the confidence of the army. So you can understand why Robert Mugabe was so desperate to assert his authority in ZIPA. Were it not for Rex Nhongo and Samora Machel, Mugabe would have not only been humiliated in Geneva, but also found himself with no army to lead, rendering himself a non-entity. But Rex Nhongo stepped up for Mugabe. He showed up for Mugabe. You see, rather than travel to the Geneva conference with the others, Rex Nhongo chose to remain behind to make sure that there was no repeat of the Nari rebellion. Because it was very clear that the ZIPA military committee no longer wanted anything to do with Mugabe, Tongo, and the old guard of the Dairechimurenga. Another Nari rebellion was on the cards. So, in part 3, we are going to take a look at this Nari rebellion thing and MUJURU's role in quelling it. We will take a look at how Tongo Gara neutralized the ZIPA military committee, which had become a problem, and how Mugabe asserted himself as ZANU president. As always, thank you so much for watching. And if you enjoy the content, please do like and share.